everyone. Welcome to Midweek at the Compass. My name's Jake, one of the pastors here. Glad you're taking the time to join us, where we've just kicked off a brand new sermon series called Egypt, A Line in the Sand. And we're learning all about these biblical and historical concepts of the stories that we read of what happens in Egypt. Ultimately, spoiler alert, leading to a conclusion of Jesus' time there as we are getting ready to move into the Christmas season. But before we get way too far ahead, let's take a few moments just to rehash what it is that we were talking about this week. And we were learning about Abraham and how he ultimately was able to lead through a crisis situation. And that's a story that each of us has to deal with, whether that's in our personal life or our professional life. There are going to be times where things just don't run smooth, or you feel like you're getting tossed into the deep end. What do you do? How do you manage it? Well, I'm really excited to introduce to you our guest today, Steve Gillen. He has been a pastor for quite a while at some churches that you have heard of. But Steve, first off, and most importantly, thanks for joining.
Oh, thanks. It's good to be here.
So I'm wondering, could you just tell us a little bit about who you are?
Yeah. So grew up in Missouri, ended up starting a church on campus with a group of guys, and then that went well. And as we graduated, there's this church in Chicago I hadn't heard of called Willow Creek that had heard of us and hired us, and a couple of us, and started a ministry then back in the 90s when I was young. And we thought it'd be there for just a couple of years, and 25 years later, I was still there. And so part of my story is, for whatever reason, I was kind of one of the people that when there was a crisis at a ministry or a church from Willow, I would go in and step in on interim and try to get it turned around with good space and then move to the next one. Kind of bounced around and ended up leading one of their congregations on the North Shore for 10 years before stepping in a crisis situation at Willow a couple years ago to interim lead that through the crisis for 2 years. Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about how all of that ended up coming about. So how did you end up going from ministry position to ministry position? Yeah. Just give a little bit of context of how that came to be.
Yeah, so, well, it just stumbled into it. That first ministry that I was hired from college to come help start, that is a 20-something ministry, grew to about 2,000 people. And there was a crisis within the first 2 years where the leader of it resigned and the whole staff would resign within 6 months. And truthfully, I would have resigned, but my wife got diagnosed with cancer in there. And so we said, we can't leave, we got to stay. And so I ended up by myself with a very large congregation trying to think of how do we lead it. And the thought was this thing is not going to survive, but it did. And the lessons learned there, trying to keep it running, keep a weekly service going, small groups going, serving going, kind of set me up for maybe the next one that hit. They're like, hey, you did pretty well. Why don't you try this one? And so that's kind of how it happened. I would just kind of bounce around different things and kind of develop a skill set. And how do you lead through crisis? How do you help people in times of change and transition, stabilize the ship, get in a better spot? So
I went to college in Elmhurst, and Willow at that time was my home church. We would make the half-hour trek, and I'm guessing it was the same young adult ministry that you're talking about that I was a part of, and was very faith-forming for me. So anyways, that's fascinating. I didn't make that connection ahead of time.
Well, it was funny because, that when it first hit, there was one Sunday where I realized I'm the only staff member left. There was a Saturday night then. And I thought, well, this is just going to be over. I'm very sad about it, but I got to find a new job. And right as the worship was beginning, I turned around, and right behind me was a friend of mine who didn't go to church, never had gone to church. And I remember looking at him, and I turned back around, and I thought, when this ends, what chance does he have of discovering who God is and his love? And it just, this immense determination, I felt, well, that was like, this can't end. If for no one else, just for him. And that kind of resolve, it was a key moment for me to go, no, like if we can keep churches and ministries running, you never know how many more people like that will have an open door, an opportunity to discover faith. And on the opposite side, I've seen when churches fail, ministries fail, some walk away and don't return, and even more so, some of their kids and teens walk away. And so I thought, boy, if there's anything I can do to stabilize this, to help them get better, to clean house where it needs to get cleaned up, then that felt really meaningful to me. Yeah.
So have there been any consistencies things that have been similar across the board into some of these different areas that you've walked into. When you're walking into a crisis situation,
Yeah.
what are some things that are evident from the get-go?
When I think about crisis, in my opinion, the core of it, and they're similar in organizations, individuals, and families, the core of it, there's a loss. Sometimes it's a loss of health, a loss of a job, loss of finances, a loss of a pastor, even just the loss, I had a church that was like this and it's not like that anymore. And each of those triggers your fight or flight response, right? So you have the anxiety, you have the anger, you have the grief, all these emotions. And at the core of it too is a resistance to change, because what you knew is no longer going to be reality, and all of us hate change. So my job was honestly to step in and one, to listen to their pain and frustration and validate it. It is very real. And two, to be truthful. What you've known, it was great and we should celebrate it, but we are changing. In fact, it's already changed. That's why you're grieving. But three, to then lead a process as best I could to rebuild trust, which by the way, rebuild trust is the wrong phrase. Really, it's the job of the leader is to act in a trustworthy way, and you hope they will give you their trust. They don't have to. But if I act in trustworthy ways, hopefully they'll have a point where they give me their trust. And moving forward, you build it's not the old church, it's not the old ministry, it's something new. But we'll build it together in a trustworthy way. And so that's really my job. And as a pastor, then it's to care for those even when they're leaving, to care for those even when they're angry, to support those even when they may criticize or attack, knowing this is the fight response, right? This fight or flight, you're leaving church or you're angry, and to be willing to forgive. It's not personal. Yeah, and so what I've seen time and time again is people are remarkably forgiving, people are remarkably trusting, and when you act in a trustworthy way, over time, many times they do come to a place where they trust you again, and then you can rebuild. So,
as you're thinking about it, when you were walking into all of these different ministry areas, it sounds like the first thing you were doing was just listening to people. What were some of the other first steps of, day one, day 10? Like, what are the very first things when you're walking into a situation that really just needs a little bit of triage? What are some of the things that you personally had done? Yeah,
so triage is the right word. So part of the interesting thing is, so I do this in the church world. My wife works in emergency room and in trauma centers. And so her education helped me in some of mine, where some of the times what you're dealing with is very much like an emergency room. Someone shows up, you're trying to get an assessment, what's actually happening here. Then from there, you're trying to assess how severe is this? And then if it's at the most severe, then what you're doing is you're trying to assess, how do we stay focused on the things that are the most dangerous for the person, right? So in the ER, she talks about the distracting injury. You have a horrible, traumatic accident. Someone walks in and you can look at a compound fractured leg and get focused on it and miss the fact they can't breathe. And so they have a structure in place where they go A, B, C's. We're starting with the airway. Are they getting air? B's breathing. Are their lungs working? C's circulation. And you work down and basically they're going, what can kill you in 3 minutes? What in 5? What in 10? And as you work down, it helps you stay focused on what's most important. So similarly with the church, the very first thing I'm trying to do is situational awareness. So the most recent one of these I stepped in was, I was the emergency successor at Willow Creek. And, traumatic moment where there were accusations against the founding pastor. He retired early. The successor stepped in. They resigned suddenly. Within days of each other, the board all resigned. And I found out I was the emergency successor. I'm now stepping in to lead this. And day one was honestly, we're going to spend a day to go get situational awareness. What actually is happening? So we literally had a team I brought together, listed out every ministry at the Barrington campus, which is a big church, and every congregation, the other 7. And we just did red, yellow, green. Are they in a good place, not great, or dangerous? And then you prioritize, like what was the most critical to deal with, was least critical. But then within that, that's you're getting situational awareness. The truth is that's an organization side. These are people. So in every one of these that I've done, one of the very first things I do is I just sit with the people and listen. And there you're going to get a very fast sense. Some of the times this is town halls. I'm a big believer. Let's just get together and do open Q&A. My first full day at Barrington, we did a 3-hour staff meeting, and I just said, I'm doing Q&A. Any questions? Okay. And I thought it'd go an hour. It went 3, and we had to do more of those. But part of this is you're getting the venom out because people are hurt. Yeah. And if you don't allow them to say it, it just sits in them. And sometimes just saying it, sometimes they'll say, oh, I said that wrong. It was too much anger. But it helped me go, how hurt are they? And the willingness to listen, to say, here's what I can tell you. Here I don't know, but we'll get back to you. Some of the times that helped and just showed he actually cares. And actually, when someone's wounded, the reality that someone cares for them impacts them far more than people know.
I've always been told from a pastoral role, right, you could give the best message in the world, you could do all of these great events and activities, but at the end of the day, the people that are going to remember you are the ones where you went and you sat in the hospital room with their loved one who was sick. It's just taking the time to care for people where they are.
Yeah, it makes a big difference.
It does,
especially
absolutely.
in a crisis.
So one of the interesting things to me is you've gone into some different ministry roles on an interim basis, and yet you were still able to affect change.
Oh, of course.
How in the world do you, one, do change management just in general? Maybe we'll start there, but know that the second question is going to ultimately be, how do you also impact change when people know that you're not the long-term guy?
Well, so on Leading Change, the book I always go to, that's the name of the book, it's Cotter's Leading Change. And what he describes is, again, similar to that when I was describing in the ER, having a system in place so you can take care of the right things at the right time. Cotter just creates a framework by which to think, how do you do a good change process that honors people, respects them, and gives them the time to process the change with you? So your first question was, how do you change things
Just in general, yeah.
So here's the nice thing about a crisis. In a crisis, everyone wants change. In normal times, in peace times, nobody wants change. Don't change anything. In a crisis, depending on the crisis, some of the times they want a little change. Sometimes they want everything to change. Actually, the danger of the real severe crisis is they want to clean house and change everything, and that's not good. When I stepped in at Willow, one of my advisors who had helped another large organization through a similar thing, he said, everyone's going to want you to clean house with a blowtorch. The goal, he said, is use a broom. Be very, very strategic and tactical. You're not going to fire the whole staff. These are good people. Some of these are victims too. You want to care for them. So when people want just a new day, he said, resist that and instead go, no, we're going to honor the old day. We're going to move to a new day, but we're not going to just tear the house down. And so really in a crisis, it's a wonderful point to change things. And I actually tell leaders that aren't in crisis, think about the change you'd like to have when there's a crisis. What are the changes you should make? And initial question was, how can you make changes in interim? Absolutely. You have to get, in my opinion, you have to build their trust. You have to be wise about it. You have to communicate it very well. You have to be open to feedback if you need to adjust it. Because in an interim, you usually don't know the people.
Yeah.
And so, one of mine a couple of years ago, this is before Willow, South Barrington. This is like probably 15 years ago. Campus in crisis that I was asked to step into. And it was 2008. There's a financial crisis in our world at that point. You've got the mortgage crisis, everything else. And I just stepped in and I said, I just was honest. I said, this is my third straight interim in 6 months. I'm a little tired. I'm a little frustrated because some of you have created this crisis, but I'm going to pastor you. And here's what I'd ask. I want us to do some good things as a church. So if you're in to try, here's what I want you to do. And I said, I want you to come to church early because guests show up here early. I want you to sit down front so we have the back seats to the guests. I want you to serve if you're not serving. If you don't want to do that, I get it. Don't complain, but we're going to try to fix this church. And I kind of thought they would be mad and say, we don't like this. It's harsher than it would have been. But it was the right season. It's the way I felt like I should lead, and actually responded really well to it. Some said, great, I don't want to be part of this church. I wish you the best. I really do. Understand why you leave. But the ones who stayed said, good, we want a church that's doing some stuff. Does that make sense?
It does.
So each situation's unique. But that's, yeah. So yes, I definitely think you can change things. You got to be wise. You got to be thoughtful. You got to be willing to change direction. But
You touched on one thing in the midst there that I want to make sure we get back to a little bit. You just kind of mentioned your personal self in the midst of change.
Oh, sure.
So as you were walking into a crisis situation, how do you protect yourself? How do you care well for yourself physically and spiritually? What did that process play out like for you?
Yeah. What I'm sharing is from my pain. It's from mistakes. So
don't make them. Yeah.
Yeah. I did not walk into these knowing these. Part of this I talked about it earlier. Crises it's really a threat to us, and so from a physiological standpoint, it really is the fight or flight mechanisms that are kicking in. So you have stress hormones that are kicking in, elevated adrenaline and cortisol, all of these things. And we know those not cared for have a detrimental impact to your body. So there's a physical side. There's also a spiritual side. So I always tell people, the phrase I use is don't waste a crisis. God can teach you such great things in a crisis, whether it's personal or organizational. But the temptation of crisis is personally go, I just want it over. And so you can bury your head in the sand. You can run away. You can pretend it doesn't exist. But actually, there's some great things to shape you. So I try on a spiritual level to say, all right, God, this is another unique chance. What do you want to teach me? One of these, I felt like the Psalms connected. For years as a pastor, you would never admit this, but like the Psalms, I don't identify with it. And then there was one crisis where every day I started with a Psalm, and I was like, I felt like the Psalm that day was the perfect one for the day I was in. So God can teach you things during these crises that are wonderful. From a physical standpoint, I would say for me personally, and anyone who's in a crisis, whether it's anything in your life, take seriously how impactful stress is to your body. You need daily physical exercise, healthy eating, sleep. Oftentimes when people are in these kind of crises, they're getting 3-4 hours of sleep. No, you got to get good sleep. Time with friends. People in crisis, they always say to me, I don't have time for that. No. If you don't make time, this will have a dramatic impact on your faith in your body. A crisis can either grow your faith or crush it. A crisis can actually build healthier patterns in your life, or it can destroy them. And it's your choice.
Do you have any stories that you'd be willing or able to share just kind of off the cuff of, we talk about crisis, and a lot of times it feels like a very weighty conversation, a very difficult one where people don't want to even be in it.
Right.
But on the back end of it, a lot of times there's good things that come out of wading into a crisis situation, leading through it. Do you have any stories that come to mind of something successful that's come out of maybe one of your interim stints?
Oh, well, I mean, the first one we talked about, that ministry that you were a part of, the crisis, the reason that the staff fell apart, the reason it kind of went off the rails was how we had, when you start a ministry or any organization, the first few months establishes a pattern of how you're going to do things. And the pattern we established was not healthy. We were working 7 days a week, no Sabbath. It was long hours. It was stressful. There were relational fractures. We were a team of all 20-somethings that I think every one of us spent time in the hospital the first year. And that's really bizarre. Well, we did not have a healthy pattern. The crisis, when that all fell apart, gave us a chance to course correct, and much easier in a crisis than at normal time. And we course corrected and changed our pattern. We valued Sabbath. We even talked about there's days we won't email each other or call because we need to rest. We focused more on scripture than strategies. It was a really good course correct, and I think it's why the ministry did well after that. Personally, one of the crises I had, which I didn't handle well, and physically just had physical pain, had a year where I was sick, basically a whole year. And doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. Finally identified, really, it's uncared for stress. It's where I changed the patterns of my eating, of my exercise, of my relationships. So there's always these chances where you're going to get feedback to go, oh, this is something I have to adjust in my life or in our ministry. And that's the benefit, if you'll handle it the right way, if you'll get feedback and adjust based on that.
When you stepped into the lead role at Willow, were there moments where you felt like God tapped the wrong guy on the shoulder? Or was it something where you had developed confidence over the years of, God's been wiring me for something, I wonder if this is it or just another step in the way?
I wouldn't say, I didn't have the feeling that God tapped the wrong guy on the shoulder. That was not the feeling. I did have moments, though, where I looked at a problem in front of us and I said, I don't know how to deal with that one. And the primary crisis people saw when they looked at what we were going through was, how do you deal with accusations of harassment against a founding pastor? That was the initial one, that was the primary one. But it triggered all these other crises, from a financial crisis, a staffing crisis, then a crisis of trust. I mean, it was just so many. And so, no, there were multiple days where I looked at the day and I went, okay, I haven't faced this one, and I don't know who to call.
Yeah.
And so that was, those are the moments where I realized some of these I'm kind of facing on my own. There were some where I was like, oh, I've done this before. And did I start with prayer? Maybe not. These other ones, it was like, I pause for a second, let's get on our knees and pray. And the team would pray about it. And you go, who are we looking for? God provide. And those, I would say, actually are the ones that we probably gave God more credit for than, oh yeah, we can handle this. We'll take care of these. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think that's a great segue. I mean, we've been talking about church world, and we've been tying in some really practical aspects of all of it. But maybe let's use that as a launching pad to get into it, of when you feel like you don't know the answer of what to do in a certain situation, especially one where it feels like the weight of the world might be resting on your shoulders. I mean, I know it's not, but scripturally also. I know it's not. It feels that way. But it can feel that way.
Yes.
Starting with prayer is absolutely the foundation.
Yeah.
But what are some next steps of a situation you've never dealt with before or don't even know where to start? How did you walk through some of those situations?
Yeah. All right, so obviously there's a spiritual side of prayer, really surrendering to God, asking for his guidance. But something I've found is there are people around you who can help. And what I found in my life is every problem I faced that I didn't know how to solve, I would ask, I would even ask, like, who do you know who's good at this? And I'd get 3 or 4 names, and I would ask them for help. I can't remember a single person who said no.
Interesting.
Everyone wants to help, especially if you're about something good, facing something tough, and if they've been through it, they wish they had someone to help them, so they're willing to help. And so, I talked about an advisor earlier, but I'm a big believer, any crisis of your life, build some advisory teams. If you're having a health crisis, if you don't work in the health profession, good luck navigating that. So who do you know? If it's a mental health issue with you or a family member, how do you navigate that? Get some people who've navigated it before, get them around you, ask for advice and help. Resist the temptation to walk it alone. That's the temptation in a crisis, is go, I got myself into this, I better get myself out of this. That is the worst advice. Yes, you need to get yourself out of this, but do it with a team. Do it with God, reading scripture. The other side is, what I've found is Jesus' teachings and the teaching of scriptures have very practical application.
Okay.
So one of the crises we faced, I was building a church building years ago. It was supposed to be a $25 million build, and the initial bids came in at 35. And we needed to start construction in the next month. And I had a group of my advisors saying, just start, because the longer you wait, the more expensive it gets. I had another group that says, don't. You want to make sure you get the price in line first. And then I finally had a spiritual advisor said, did Jesus ever say anything about starting construction when you don't have the funds? Well, actually, he did. He talked about what a fool it is that if you start to build a tower but don't have the funds to finish it, everyone will mock you. And I went back to the church. I said, we're not going to start construction. Jesus actually had something to say about this. And I found that time again that his teaching is very practical. In that example, we waited 6 months. We got the pricing in order. We hit our budget. And everyone thought we were so smart to listen to the Bible.
That's fascinating. People thinking you're intelligent at a church for listening to what Scripture says. Not a guarantee all the time either.
Right. And it wasn't my first go-to.
Yeah.
I went to advisors first.
Right.
Because I really didn't think the Bible had something to say about this.
I feel like I would go to books, like I'd go back to Good to Great, or, some sort of thing where I've read in a past life or at church here or whatever the case might be. Right. But I would own the fact that it wouldn't always be my first inclination to turn to Scripture, the words and actions of Jesus in particular, and find out what we can find out.
Well, and the danger for a leader is the insecurity that you have to have the answer can lead you to just fake one when you don't. If you don't know you have the answer, then pause, acknowledge it. People actually trust you more if you then go, I don't know the answer, but I'm going to figure it out, rather than getting up and just making something up that can lead you down a really bad path.
I'm not going to pretend this is a leadership podcast by and large, but that is a fantastic nugget for everyone to take away from this. You don't have to fake like you know an answer when you don't.
No.
The humility will go such a longer way at the end of the day than trying to say that, yes, this is definitively the correct answer. And you're sitting there internally like, I have no idea. No idea, but I'm going to put on a face that makes it seem like I do.
Well, and the foolish thing is I felt the pressure to have the right answer, and I'm a pastor. I don't do construction. And yet I felt that temptation. The leader has to have the answer. How do I do this? And that, that phrase, fake it, no, this is one where acknowledge you don't have it, get some people around you, look to Scripture, pray. But yeah, it can be tempting to pretend.
So I'm wondering just if you have another nugget of wisdom in terms of just change management as well.
Sure.
Somebody in their family life, in their professional life, again, 99% of the people joining don't work at a church, and that's fantastic.
Absolutely.
How do you encourage people to effectively lead change in their day-to-day life?
Yeah. Can I flip it?
Yes.
What I'd love to do is give coaching, because we're talking, I'm assuming, to people who primarily attend this church, right?
Yeah.
What I would rather do is, can I give them coaching on how do you survive change?
Better.
All right. Here's the truth. Every church I've been a part of, I grew up in a church, I lead churches, they're constantly changing. I was a philosophy major in college, and there's one Greek philosopher who said something that stayed with me. Heraclitus said the phrase, "You can never step into the same river twice." And when I first heard that, I thought, that's ludicrous. I grew up in Missouri, you step in the same rooms all the time. But his teaching was, no, that river, it changes based on has it rained or not. Depending on the season, the trees and the foliage around it change. But even over time, erosion changes it. But more than that, you change. So you're not the same person that's stepping into that river. And what he was saying is we exist in a world that is in constant flux, and something in us wants to keep things the same. We feel safe that way. And so any change disrupts us. But if you can accept that things are changing and accept that you're changing, you can become a little more adept to surviving and thriving in this world of change. And so in the church world, I go, if you're going to be a part of a church, the ones I've seen who survived the best, who thrived at church, get comfortable with the fact that churches change, ministries change, staff changes, preachers change, preaching styles change. There's change. And so if your goal is, I want my church to never change, I think you're going to be really frustrated. If instead you can go, hey, things are always changing. And there are good changes and bad changes. When it's not good, I'm going to speak to it. But to understand your job is actually to lead yourself. And it's okay. There's going to be some changes where you feel angered, frustrated. You're going to feel like, man, they took what was my favorite part of this. And sometimes after those changes, you go, you know what? It's no longer the church that I want to be part of. That's okay. We live in America. There's hundreds of churches around here. But to not allow your character to, the temptation I see amongst Christians is when the church changes, it feels like license to have unbiblical character. I can now be cynical and bitter and angry. I can be venomous. The Bible never says that. And this is what I found in crises for myself. A crisis and change can either make you a more hopeful, gentle, kind person, or it can make you more bitter, angry, and cynical. But it's your choice. It's how you view it. And my hope is that Christians who, once they see that, then can better navigate change and even just hold each other accountable. Do you see me becoming more hopeful or more cynical? And I'll be honest. Again, I'm 25 plus years of ministry. Our church needs more hopeful people, fruit of the Spirit people, than cynical, bitter, angry people. And so I always tell, okay, so this is what I say to my friends. I'm saying it to this very strange place. I don't know who's all going. My friends, I will go, hey, okay, I sense you're becoming pretty bitter here. You feel that? And they go, yeah. I go, how long do you need to be bitter? I mean, you're cynical. Do you need a day? How about 6 weeks? How about I let you be? How about the next 20 minutes? Say everything you want to say, but then and depending on. But what I want to say to them is, don't get to be old at the end of your life and you allowed a change or a loss or a crisis to make you somebody bitter, angry, and cynical. Be one of the people who faced all that, felt the pain, felt the emotion, grieved it appropriately, processed it, and maintained hope in the one who's called you to this. Does that make sense?
It does.
So that's more. And again, churches will get changed wrong. Give feedback. Tell the pastors, the leaders, you can do this better. Pastors are notorious for not listening, for not speaking, for not taking in feedback. Yeah, totally.
And we're sorry for that.
Yeah, and give feedback to it. But each of us stands before God individually of how we handled this life. And anyway.
So let's talk about one last change. How did God lead you from being the interim guy at Willow in different roles and seasons to where you are now? And let people know where you are now.
Yeah, so so left Willow, stepped out. It was in the middle of COVID. My last Sunday was the day that the whole state shut down.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it was a very chaotic time. I ended up staying a few weeks more just to stabilize the congregation at the beginning of COVID.
Yeah.
And then stepped out and thought we would begin the process to join another church staff, something like that, and started an interview. So how short an answer do you want, by the way? Short or?
Give as much. We got as much time as you want to give.
So here was the fun thing. So I thought I'll go to a church, and so I'm starting to have conversations with some. It's COVID. My family, first time in our lives, doesn't have a church. So I said, hey, Sundays we'll gather together and we'll watch the church I'm interviewing at. And first Sunday I noticed my kids who were teenagers. Within 10 minutes, they really weren't paying attention. Second Sunday was a little less. So I thought, let's go to a different church. Third Sunday, closed the laptop. And they just said, no, we're not going to do this. And my kids said, we grew up in this style of church of Willow. This is all we've known. We would like something different.
Interesting.
We don't want a big show. We want something more personal and connected and relational and sincere. And it was very threatening to me because I said, well, I've only known this model. I don't know how But it was interesting that we then just started something, the four of us. And I said, well, we'll call it home church. And the four of us would open a passage of scripture. We'd say prayer over each other and pray for each other. We'd share what we thought about the scripture. It was actually, we would all say it was one of our favorite church experiences in the midst of COVID. My wife working at a COVID hospital and afraid of what that meant, praying for each other. And quite meaningful. And I was hanging out with friends who, many of them did not have a church. And as they heard about home church, our home church, they started saying, can we come?
Yeah.
And I said, no, it's too weird, right? I don't know. It's COVID, my wife might be bringing COVID home. It was back at the very beginning, right?
Yeah.
But as time passed, we got towards the end of that year, and several of them said to me, this will be the first Christmas we haven't had a church as Christians. And so a few of them came to me and said, would you just do something online? And so basically we said, we'll do a 3-week Advent. We're going to invite you into our home. We'll call it home church. And invited 50 friends. And I said, if you know somebody, invite them. So we had 300 families on with us to start the thing.
Wow.
So it was a fun little experiment. And then we said, well, we'll keep going in January, and then in February, and then in March. And then eventually we realized this is a church plant. We didn't know it. And so we stumbled into it. We changed the name to Hope. Okay. And so we've been going for about a year now, and a year and a half, I should say. And it's been a great start to a church. Yeah. Very massive surprise. Stumbled into it.
I don't know that I've ever heard the story of somebody stumbling into a church plant. That's kind of wild.
Super strange, isn't it? And it was. When we tell people, they're like, "What was your launch plan?" I said, we didn't have a launch plan. It was very weird. Started with our family in COVID, unable to do anything. It's been a very unique thing, but God's just kind of led us one step at a time, and it's been really fun. Yeah.
So where is Hope, and where can people find out more if they're interested?
Yeah, we meet in Glenview, Illinois. We're at North Shore of Chicago. You can go to hopecommunity.net. That's our website. And it's fun. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Steve, thank you so much for making the trek down
Great
here
to
have this conversation. Yeah. Really, even if it was just for me, I loved it. Absolutely loved it. Thank you.
It was great being with you. Yeah. All the best to you.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So make sure you join us next time we're together here in Midweek at the Compass, where we're going to be talking about legacy. We're going to be joined by a pastor in Aurora. His name is Derek Johnson. Derek's got a really fascinating story because he was an incredibly high-level collegiate athlete, was able to turn pro, and yet God had something different in store and in mind for him, and one that impacted his legacy and countless others as well. So make sure you join us, hear more of that story next time we're together here on Midweek at the Compass.